Sri Lanka is smaller than Ireland. It holds around 22 million people, more than 3 times as many. And across roughly 2/3 of that island, the rain does not fall often enough or evenly enough to grow rice. That dry 2/3 is where most of Sri Lanka's rice is grown. Both of those statements are correct. Neither one is an exaggeration. The northern and eastern lowlands are what geographers call the dry zone. The rain there arrives in 2 short seasons, then stops. For months, the ground goes hard. The streams thin to sand. Rice, the crop the entire island eats, needs standing water for most of its growing life. And yet, the districts around Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa, the driest, hottest, least forgiving farmland on the island, produce more paddy than anywhere else in the country. Look down at that landscape from the air and you begin to see why. The dry zone is freckled with water. Hundreds of pools, some the size of a football pitch, some the size of a small sea, sitting in the flat scrub with the sky reflected in them. They look like lakes. They are not lakes. Not one of them. Sri Lanka has around 18,000 of these water bodies. Measured against its land area, that is the highest density of reservoirs anywhere on Earth. Roughly 230 hectares of stored water for every 100 square kilometres of ground. 10,000 of them are still in daily use by farmers, and around 15,000 of them were dug before the year 1300. Which raises a question that most people never think to ask about an island this green. Where is all the water coming from? And who moved it here? The answer is that almost nothing you are looking at is accidental. The green is engineered. The lakes were carried out of the ground in baskets. The forest that looks ancient is, in places, only 600 years old, and it is growing on top of a civilization that walked away. This is Sri Lanka. A country the size of a large county, holding the population of a large nation, on ground that had to be rebuilt before it could be lived on. And one of the men who rebuilt it was killed by his own son, over a treasure he refused to hand over. We will come back to him. Start in the north-central plain, at Anuradhapura. Today, it is a quiet town of white domes and old stone in a landscape of scrub and paddy. For more than 1,000 years, it was the capital of the island and one of the largest cities in the ancient world. The city was founded in a place that should not have supported a city. There is no great river running through Anuradhapura. There is no reliable spring. The rain comes twice a year and then abandons the ground for months. So the first thing the kings of Anuradhapura built was not a palace, it was a reservoir. Around the 4th century before the Common Era, King Pandukapaya ordered the damming of a seasonal stream on the edge of his new settlement. The result was Abaya Wewa, an earthen wall packed by hand, holding back water that would otherwise have run off into the flat country and evaporated. It is the oldest recorded artificial reservoir on the island, and it is still holding water today, more than 2,300 years later. Everything that followed came out of that one idea. The Sinhala word for these reservoirs is wewa, a tank in the local English. And what the engineers of Anuradhapura worked out over centuries of trial is that a single tank is worth very little on its own. A single tank fills in the monsoon, then leaks, silts, evaporates, and empties. But a chain of tanks behaves differently. The North Central Plain looks flat. It is not. It is gently undulating, a landscape of shallow valleys so subtle that you can stand in one and not know it. The tank builders read those valleys. They placed a small tank near the top of one, another below it, another below that, each catching what the one above released or lost. The overflow of the highest became the inflow of the next. Seepage that would have vanished underground reappeared downhill as the water table under the tank below. Silt was trapped in strips of grass and reeds planted at the inflow, so the reservoirs below stayed clean.
Nothing was thrown away.
The water was used and used again and used again, all the way down the valley to the paddy fields at the bottom. They called it Elangawa, the cascade. Then there was the problem of getting water out. Cut a hole near the top of an earth dam and you drain only the warm surface layer, and when the level drops, you cannot reach the rest. Cut a hole near the bottom and the pressure of the whole reservoir turns the outflow into a jet that will chew through the dam and take the structure with it. The solution was a chamber sunk into the base of the dam wall, which the water entered before it exited. Inside, the pressure fell away. What came out the far side was not a jet. It was a measured flow a farmer could work with. They called it the bisakotua, a valve pit built of dressed stone, buried inside an earth wall, doing quietly and mechanically what a modern sluice gate does. The oldest surviving examples date to the first centuries of the Common Era. Europe would not build anything comparable for well over 1,000 years. With water secured, Anuradhapura grew into something enormous. Monastery complexes with thousands of resident monks, stupas of solid brick that ranked among the tallest structures on earth at the time of building, second only to the pyramids at Giza. And in the center of the city, a fig tree. The Sri Mahabodhi was planted from a cutting of the tree the Buddha is said to have sat beneath in northern India. The cutting arrived in the 3rd century before the Common Era, carried by the nun Sanghamitta. It has been tended continuously ever since by an unbroken line of caretakers through invasion, famine, and the fall of the city around it. It is the oldest living human-planted tree on Earth with a recorded planting date. People still come at dawn to sit with it. They bring water in clay pots, which is, in this landscape, the most valuable offering anyone can make. 55 kilometers to the southeast of Anuradhapura, a block of hardened magma stands 200 meters above the plain. It is the plug of an extinct volcano, and the softer rock that once surrounded it has weathered away, leaving a red-brown tower with sheer sides. On top of it, someone built a palace. Sigiriya was constructed in the 5th century, and everything about it is a contradiction. It was built by a man remembered as a murderer. It is, by common agreement, the most beautiful thing on the island. At the base of the rock lie water gardens, laid out in symmetrical pools and channels. There are fountains there, fed by underground conduits, and driven by nothing but the pressure difference between one part of the garden and another. No pumps, no moving parts. In heavy monsoon rain, they still work. The water rises out of the same limestone jets it rose from 1,500 years ago. Halfway up the western face, sheltered by overhanging rock, are the frescoes. Women painted in ochre and green, their eyes turned toward the plain. There were once hundreds, 21 survive. Below them runs a wall polished to such a shine that it was called the Mirror Wall. Visitors climbing the rock between the 8th and the 10th centuries scratched verses into it, addressed to the painted women. Around 700 of those inscriptions have been read. Ordinary people, 1,000 years dead, writing that they came, that they looked, and that they were moved. It is the earliest surviving graffiti in South Asia, and it is almost entirely tender. Near the summit, the stairway passes between two carved paws of brick and stone, all that remains of a lion whose open mouth was once the doorway. The rock takes its name from it, Sinharaja, Lion Rock. The king who built it was called Kashyapa, and to understand why a man would move his capital to the top of a rock, you have to understand what he had just done to get there. We will come back to that too. To understand where the water in those tanks came from, you have to leave the plain and climb. The center of the island is a knot of mountains, ridges, and plateaus, rising to just over 2,500 meters. It is a small area, perhaps a fifth of the country, and every significant river on the island begins there. 103 of them. They rise in the central highlands and run outward in every direction like spokes to the sea.
The longest
Is the Mahaweli. It gathers on the western slopes, curls east and north for 335 kilometers, and empties into the Indian Ocean near Trincomalee. Up on the highest of those plateaus, at Horton Plains, the landscape stops looking tropical altogether. It is cold there. Frost forms in the hollows on winter mornings. The trees are stunted and wind-bent, hung with pale moss, and the ground between them is open grassland the color of straw. At the southern edge of the plateau, the ground simply ends. The escarpment drops away for the better part of 900 meters. On a clear day, you can see to the ocean. On most days, you can see nothing because the cloud sits in the gap. The reason all of this matters is a matter of geometry. The southwest monsoon arrives between May and September, carrying moisture off the ocean. It hits the highlands, is forced upward, cools, and drops its rain on the southwestern slopes. Those slopes can take more than 2,500 millimeters in a year. Some ridges take far more. By the time that air crosses the mountains and reaches the north and east, it has almost nothing left to give. That is the whole island in one sentence. One mountain range, one wind, and two different countries on either side of it. The wet zone in the southwest, green year-round, forested, crowded. The dry zone in the north and east, brown for months, open and holding the farmland that feeds everyone. The second monsoon, the northeast, arrives between December and February and does water the dry zone, but it arrives all at once. Weeks of rain, then nothing for the rest of the year. So the problem was never that the dry zone had no water. The problem was that all of it came in a rush and then left. Everything that follows is a response to that one fact. 90 kilometers east of Anuradhapura, one of the answers has become one of the great wildlife events on Earth, and almost nobody who watches it realizes they are watching something artificial. The Minariya tank was built in the 3rd century by King Mahasena. It covers around 9 square kilometers when full, and it has been holding water for roughly 1,700 years. Every year, between about July and September, the dry season pulls the level down and exposes the bed of the reservoir. Fresh grass comes up on that ground, thick and green, while the surrounding forest is parched. And the elephants come. They come from the forests all around, converging on one shrinking body of water. 200 of them, on some evenings 300. It is the largest known gathering of wild Asian elephants anywhere in the world. They arrive in the late afternoon, in family groups, moving out of the tree line in single file. The older females lead. Calves walk under the bellies of their mothers. By dusk, there are hundreds of animals spread across a grassland that was underwater 4 months earlier, on a reservoir that people dug by hand before Rome fell. The Sri Lankan elephant is the largest of the Asian subspecies. The skin is dark, often blotched pink at the ears and trunk. The back is domed, and almost none of the males have tusks. Across the island, roughly 7 in every 100 bulls grow them. In India, the figure is many times higher. Nobody is certain why the difference is so extreme here, though centuries of capturing and killing the tusked animals almost certainly narrowed the gene pool. Today, there are thought to be fewer than 24 fully grown tuskers left alive on the island. Between 6,000 and 7,000 wild elephants remain in Sri Lanka. It is one of the largest surviving populations in Asia, held on less than 1/5 of 1% of Asia's land. That is the number to hold on to. 6,000 or 7,000 of the largest land animal in Asia, and 22 million people on the same island, drinking from the same tanks. For now, watch them at the water. We will come back to what happens when the grass runs out. A 100 kilometres southeast of Anuradhapura lies the city that replaced it. Anuradhapura fell to a South Indian invasion in the 11th century. When Sinharaja's rule was restored, the capital moved to Polonnaruwa, closer to the Mahaweli, easier to defend. And in the 12th century, Polonnaruwa produced the most ambitious builder in the island's history. Parakramabahu I took the throne in 1153. He reorganized the army, restructured the monastic orders, and rebuilt the capital in stone. But what he is remembered for is a policy about rain. The chronicles record him instructing that no drop of water falling from the sky should reach the ocean without first being put to work for people. He meant it as an engineering program, and he carried it out. Under his reign, the chronicles credit the construction or restoration of more than 1,000 tanks and hundreds of canals. The largest still dominates the town. Parakrama Samudra, the Sea of Parakrama, made by joining several older reservoirs into one body of water, covering around 2,500 hectares. Stand on the bund at dusk, and you cannot see the far shore. Fishermen work it. Cormorants dry their wings on the stonework. It is, to every eye, a lake. It was finished 870 years ago, and it is still irrigating rice. A short walk north of the water, at the Galvihara, 4 figures of the Buddha are cut from one wall of granite. The stone has veins running through it, and the sculptors place the figures so that the veins fall where they will do the least damage. The polish on the reclining figure, 14 meters of it, has held for 8 centuries in the open air. This was the high point, a city of monasteries, hospitals and bathing pools in the middle of the most productive irrigated landscape in South Asia. Within 50 years of Parakramabahu's death, almost all of it was empty. Hold that. It is the hinge the whole story turns on. Cross back over the mountains to the southwest, and the island changes character completely. Sinharaja is what is left of the lowland rainforest that once covered the whole wet zone. It is not large, around 11,000 hectares, a strip of ridges and valleys perhaps 21 kilometers long. More than 60% of the trees in it grow nowhere else on Earth. Over half of the island's endemic mammals and endemic butterflies live inside that one fragment. The canopy is high and closed, and the light that reaches the ground is green and weak. It rains most days. Leeches move up the leaf litter toward footsteps, and every so often the whole forest passes through at once. Sinharaja produces mixed species bird flocks, dozens of birds of many species traveling and feeding together in one loose column through the understory. Ornithologists have followed the same flocks here since the early 1980s. It is the longest continuously studied bird flock in the world. A drongo leads the noise. Babblers work the leaf litter below. For 3 or 4 minutes there is movement and sound everywhere around you, and then the wave passes and the forest goes silent again. High in the same canopy, an animal that exists nowhere else moves along the branches. The purple-faced langur is a slender, grey-black monkey with a pale ruff, endemic to Sri Lanka and endangered. It eats mature leaves, which is a difficult living and needs continuous canopy to move through. The forest it evolved in is now mostly tea, rubber, and housing. One subspecies has ended up living in the suburbs of Colombo, crossing between gardens on power lines and rooftops, feeding on ornamental trees because the forest corridors it once used no longer connect to anything. It is still here. It is simply living in a country the shape of which no longer matches the country it was built for. The same island holds the opposite kind of survivor. The Sri Lankan leopard is an endemic subspecies, and it is bigger than most leopards elsewhere in Asia. There is a reason for that. On the mainland, leopards share ground with tigers and lions, and spend a great deal of their lives avoiding them, hunting at night, dragging kills into trees. There has never been a tiger or a lion on this island. The leopard here has no competitor at all. It is the apex predator, and it behaves like one. It hunts in daylight, it sleeps in the open on rock and on the branches of trees, unbothered. Fewer than 1,000 are thought to remain. But in Block 1 of Yala, in the dry scrub of the southeast, they occur at roughly 1 animal per square kilometre, which is the highest density of leopards recorded anywhere on the planet. A cat that is common nowhere, crowded into one corner of one island. There is a pattern in that, and by now, it should be familiar. Everything on this island is compressed. There is a mountain in the south of the highlands that 4 religions climb. Near the summit of Adam's Peak, there is a depression in the rock about 1.5 meters long. Buddhists hold it to be the footprint of the Buddha. Hindus attribute it to Shiva. Muslims and some Christians hold that it was left by Adam, taking his first step outside the garden. Pilgrims climb through the night by lamplight on a staircase of 5,000 steps to be there when the sun comes up. Below that mountain, the hills fall away into the most photographed landscape on the island. And it is not what it appears to be. The tea country is beautiful in an orderly, almost European way. Bright green rows contoured around every slope, silver oaks for shade, white colonial bungalows, cool air and mist coming up the valleys in the afternoon. It looks ancient. It looks like the natural state of the highlands. It is younger than the railway, and it is what replaced a forest. In 1815, the Kandyan kingdom in these hills signed away its independence. It had held out for 3 centuries against the Portuguese and then the Dutch, protected by terrain, by malaria in the lowlands, and by the sheer difficulty of moving an army uphill. 2 years later, a rebellion in Uva was put down with such severity that the province took generations to recover. What followed was an agricultural rewrite of the entire highland interior. The British cleared the montane forest for coffee. By the middle of the century, this was one of the largest coffee-producing regions in the world. Then, in 1869, a fungus arrived. Coffee leaf rust spread from estate to estate, and within roughly 15 years, the industry was gone. 2 years before the blight, a Scottish planter named James Taylor had put in 19 acres of tea at Lulakondera Estate, near Kandy, as an experiment. He built the drying and rolling equipment himself on the estate veranda. When coffee collapsed, the planters looked around for something else to grow, and Taylor's experiment was sitting there, working. Tea differs from coffee in one crucial way. Coffee is harvested in a season. Tea is plucked every 7 to 10 days, all year, which meant a workforce brought in for a few months was no longer enough. The estates needed people who lived there permanently. They had been coming since the 1830s. Tamil labourers, recruited from the poorest districts of southern India, landing near Mannar in the northwest, then walking. The route to the hills is around 250 kilometres across the dry zone through forest full of malaria. People died on that road in numbers nobody recorded properly. Their descendants are called the Malayaha Tamils, the hill country Tamils. About 1.5 million people, distinct from the Tamil communities of the north and east, who have been on the island far longer. They were housed in what are called line rooms, terraces of single-room dwellings, back-to-back, built by the estates in the 19th century. Many families are still in them. A United Nations Special Rapporteur, who visited in 2021, described the conditions as degrading. And in 1948, the year the island became independent, they were made stateless. The Ceylon Citizenship Act granted citizenship only to those who could prove they were born on the island and that their father and grandfather were born there too. For a community whose paperwork was thin and whose grandparents were buried in India, that was an impossible bar. The law recognized roughly 17 in every 100 of them. The following year, a second act removed their vote. Close to 1 million people who picked the crop that earned the country most of its foreign currency woke up with no country at all. In 1964, an agreement between the Sri Lankan and Indian governments designated more than 500,000 of them for what was described as repatriation to a country most of them had never seen. Getting that back took 55 years and one man's entire working life. Savumiyamurthy Thondaman was born on an estate in 1913. He took over the Ceylon Workers' Congress, a trade union rooted in the tea lines, and turned it into something no government could ignore. He sat in cabinets. He traded support for legislation. Piece by piece, citizenship was restored to one category of people after another. In 2003, the last of it was granted. Every remaining person of Indian origin on the island became a citizen. Thondaman had died 4 years earlier. The estates still run. Around 470,000 people live on them. The leaf is picked by hand, almost entirely by women, because a machine cannot select the 2 leaves and a bud that make the grade. There is a daily wait to meet before anyone goes home. The tea is sold worldwide, as one of the finest in existence, and it is named after a country that no longer exists, Ceylon. Come down out of the hills and go north, as far north as the island goes, and the ground changes again. The Jaffna Peninsula is limestone, flat, pale, and porous. There is not a single significant river on it. The rain that falls there does not run across the surface. It goes straight down through the rock. So the peninsula stores its water underground, in a shallow karst aquifer, and for centuries, people have reached it with open wells. Thousands of them dug into the limestone, one to a garden. What comes up is used with enormous care. Jaffna grows red onions, chilies, and mangoes on ground that receives less rain than almost anywhere else on the island, using water nobody can see. Above it all stand the Palmyra palms, tall, ragged-crowned, drought-hardy, used for everything: timber from the trunk, thatch from the leaves, sugar from the sap, flour from the root. There are millions of them across the peninsula, and they are the reason a landscape this dry could support a dense farming population at all. The north also carries the heaviest recent history on the island. Between 1983 and 2009, Sri Lanka fought a civil war between government forces and the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam, who sought a separate state in the north and east. It lasted 26 years. Estimates of the dead run to around 100,000 people, and the final months in the northeast killed civilians in numbers that are still contested and still investigated. 2 years before it began, the Jaffna Public Library was burned. It held around 97,000 volumes, including palm leaf manuscripts that existed in no other copy. They are simply gone. The war ended in 2009. The peninsula has been rebuilt. The road and the rail line south are open, and the wells are working. That is a statement of fact, not a conclusion. Some things do not resolve in a paragraph. Follow the coast around to the south, and you reach the other face of the island. Gaul sits behind ramparts the Dutch completed in the 17th century, on a headland the Portuguese fortified before them. Inside the walls, the streets are narrow, the houses have deep verandas, and the lighthouse stands where a bastion used to. Along the coast east of it, you may see men sitting on wooden poles driven into the seabed a few meters offshore, fishing with a rod and a single line. Stilt fishing is presented as an ancient island tradition. It is not. It began in the 1940s, when wartime food shortages and crowded beaches pushed fishermen to claim spots out in the water using poles left from wrecks and old defenses. It lasted about 2 generations, then the fish moved and the tourists arrived. Most of the men on the poles today are being photographed, not fishing. That is worth knowing before you photograph them. Offshore, the seafloor drops away fast. The continental shelf off the south coast is unusually narrow, so water more than a kilometre deep sits within a short boat ride of the beach at Marissa, which is why the largest animal that has ever lived comes this close to land. Blue whales reach 30 meters and can weigh over 150 tons. Most blue whale populations migrate between polar feeding grounds and tropical breeding grounds. The population here does not. It appears to stay in the northern Indian Ocean year-round, feeding on krill and shrimp brought up by the currents along that steep drop-off. They surface with a blow that goes 6 or 7 meters into the air, hold for a few breaths, and go down. The tail comes up last. The same deep water is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. Vessels running between Suez and the Strait of Malacca pass directly through the feeding ground, and ship strikes are among the main causes of death here. Proposals to shift the lane a short distance south have gone nowhere. Further round the coast lie the older layers. Ratnapura, the city of gems, where sapphires are still washed out of riverbed gravel in pits dug by hand. Kataragama in the deep southeast, where Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and Veda families walk to the same shrine. Trincomalee in the northeast, on one of the deepest natural harbors on Earth, which is precisely why every naval power that ever came here wanted it. And then there is Colombo. Container cranes along the port, glass towers going up on reclaimed land, traffic, colonial arcades, mosques, temples and churches within a few hundred meters of each other. In 2022, this city produced the images most of the world now associates with Sri Lanka. Fuel queues stretching for kilometers, power cuts measured in hours, shortages of medicine. The country ran out of foreign currency and defaulted on its external debt for the first time in its history. For a great many people outside the island, the story stops there. That is the last thing they heard, so that is where the country stays in their minds. It is worth saying plainly what happened next. By 2025, tourist arrivals had passed 2.3 million, above the pre-crisis peak. Exports were up, reserves were the highest recorded since the collapse. None of that means the underlying problems were solved. It means the country did not stay where the cameras left it. And none of it is the reason 22 million people can live here. That reason is older, and it is buried in the dry zone, and it very nearly failed for good. Go back to Polonnaruwa at the end of the 12th century. The Sea of Parakrama is full. The canals are running. The rice is coming in. Then the kings who follow start fighting each other for the throne. It is 1215. A ruler from the Kalinga country in eastern India called Magha lands in the northeast with an army. He takes Polonnaruwa. He holds it for 20 years. The chronicles written afterwards describe what he does to the countryside in language they use nowhere else. Monasteries stripped, villages burned, land seized and handed to his own men. And the tanks are left alone. That is the part that finishes it. A cascade does not fail dramatically. It fails through neglect. Silt builds at the inflows, a sluice chamber cracks, and nobody dresses the stone. One bund breaches in a monsoon, and the water goes downhill in a rush, taking the next bund with it. Within a generation, water that had been spread across a whole valley is standing in the wrong places, in shallow, warm pools among abandoned channels, which is exactly what a mosquito needs. Malaria takes hold in the dry zone in the 13th century, and it does not leave. The people who survived the invasions and the failed harvests begin walking southwest into the wet zone, toward the hills and the coast. By 1360, the capital has moved to Kotte, near modern Colombo, on the wet side of the mountains, where rain falls all year and nobody needs a tank. And the greatest irrigated landscape in South Asia is left to the forest. For roughly 600 years, the heartland of the island was jungle. The stupas of Anuradhapura stood inside it, tree roots working into the brickwork. The Sea of Parakrama silted in and shrank. The bunds became low ridges under scrub. Wilpattu, now a national park in the northwest, is full of them. Among its natural sand-rimmed lakes lie the outlines of tanks and the foundations of villages with leopards sleeping on them. The dry zone did not empty because the land failed. It emptied because the machine that made the land livable stopped being maintained. And then The disease that filled the vacuum kept everybody out. What broke that stalemate was not archaeology. It was medicine, and it was slow. In 1934, a malaria epidemic swept the island. Millions fell ill in 9 months. Around 80,000 died in districts that had always been considered safe. That epidemic changed the politics of the island permanently. A young minister of agriculture named Don Stephen Sinharaja began a program to restore the ancient tanks and settle farming families back into the dry zone. Reservoirs that had been under forest since the 13th century were surveyed, cleared, and repaired. Then, in 1946, the spraying began, and the mosquito population in the dry zone collapsed. For the first time in 600 years, people could live in the north-central plain without expecting to bury a third of their children. The resettlement that followed was one of the largest internal migrations in the island's history. Galoya in the 1950s. Then, from the late 1970s, the Mahaweli scheme, which dammed the longest river on the island and pushed part of it north and west into the old dry zone, along routes that in places follow the logic of canals cut 1,000 years earlier. Modern Sri Lanka feeds itself on ground that was reclaimed twice, once by the ancient kings and once, after a 600-year gap, by their descendants working from the same maps. And the disease that emptied it is gone. In 2012, the last locally transmitted case of malaria on the island was recorded. In September 2016, the World Health Organization certified Sri Lanka malaria-free after a campaign that had continued through 26 years of civil war. But something moved into the dry zone during those 6 centuries, and it did not leave when people came back. Elephants need around 150 kilograms of vegetation a day, and they need to walk to get it. Their ranges cross exactly the land that has been cleared, fenced, and planted since the 1950s. 70% of the elephant range on this island now has people living in it. So the elephants come to the paddy fields at night because a field of ripening rice is the single richest meal available to a large herbivore anywhere in the landscape. Farmers sit up through the night on wooden platforms, banging tins, shouting, firing crackers into the dark. They lose crops. They lose stored grain. Sometimes they lose a house wall. And roughly 150 people are killed by elephants here every year. In the other direction, the numbers are worse. Around 400 elephants are killed each year. In 2023, it reached 488, the highest ever recorded. They are shot. They are electrocuted on illegal crop protection wires. Some are killed by explosives hidden in fruit, which detonate in the animal's mouth and leave it unable to eat. Between 2015 and 2024, close to 3,500 elephants and nearly 1,200 people died in these encounters. The island has erected enough electric fencing to circle its own coastline roughly 3 times. The deaths kept rising anyway, because fences drawn along administrative boundaries rather than along the animal's actual routes simply move the problem to the next village. Nobody in that landscape is a villain. The farmer guarding a field at 2 in the morning is not wealthy. The elephant walking into it is following a path its family has used for longer than the field has existed. Both of them need the same flat, watered ground. There is only so much of it. Which brings us back to the water and to the man who was killed for it. South of Anuradhapura, past the painted caves of Dambulla, where 5 rock shelters hold more than 150 images of the Buddha under ceilings of unbroken painting, there is a body of water called Kalawewa. It covers around 2,500 hectares. The dam that holds it runs for nearly 6 kilometers and stands over 12 meters high, and it was built with baskets, hoes, and elephants in the 5th century of the Common Era. The king who ordered it was Datusena. He came to the throne around the year 455, after years as a guerrilla fighter driving out a South Indian occupation that had held Anuradhapura for a quarter of a century. He had been a monk. He put down the robes, fought a long campaign, won it, and then spent the rest of his reign doing something far less glamorous. He built water. 18 major reservoirs by the count in the chronicles, plus canals and restorations across the whole plain. And one canal above all the others. The Yoda Ella runs from Kalawewa to the tanks of Anuradhapura. It is around 87 kilometers long. Over the first 27 kilometers of that distance, it falls less than 10 centimeters for every kilometer it travels. Consider what that means. 10 centimeters, less than the length of a hand. To move water that far at that gradient, you must survey a route across 87 kilometers of undulating ground and hold a slope the human eye cannot detect with no optical instruments of any kind. Too steep, and the water accelerates and scours out its own bed. Too shallow, and it stops moving, drops its silt, and chokes. They found the line, and the water ran, and it ran slowly enough to carry its silt all the way to the city, and gently enough not to cut its own bed. British engineers who surveyed it in the 19th century did not initially believe the gradient figures they were producing and remeasured. Now, the chronicles. It is somewhere in the 470s. The exact year is disputed. Datusena has 2 sons. Moggallana is born of the royal consort and is the recognized heir. Kashyapa, the elder, is born of a woman of lower rank, and by the rules of succession, he is entitled to nothing. Kashyapa has an ally. The commander of the army, a man named Megara, has his own grievance against the old king. Together, they seize the throne. Datusena is taken and imprisoned. Moggallana escapes across the water to India and begins raising an army. And then Megara tells Kashyapa that the old king has hidden a treasure. Kashyapa demands it. The prisoner says nothing. He is asked again and again, and each time he refuses, and each time the demand grows harder. Finally, Datusena agrees. He will show them where the treasure is. He asks only to be taken to the Bund of Kalawewa first, so that he can visit the monk who had been his teacher and companion for many years. Kashyapa agrees and sends a chariot with a broken axle so that his father will be humiliated on the journey. The old king reaches the reservoir. He goes down into the water and bathes. He comes up and he turns to the friends who have come with him, and he gestures out across the whole shining surface of the tank he built. "This," he says, "is all the treasure I have." The answer is carried back to the capital. Kashyapa takes it as contempt rather than as a plain statement of fact and gives the order. The chronicles differ on the method. Some say his father was executed. Others say he was sealed alive into the wall of the dam. All of them agree on the essential act. The king who put the country's entire wealth into water was killed by his son for refusing to produce gold that did not exist. Kashyapa was given a name after that, Kashyapa the Patricide. He could not stay in Anuradhapura. The monks would not have him, the people would not have him, and his brother was somewhere across the sea assembling soldiers. So he moved his court to the top of a rock. That is why Sigiriya exists. The frescoes, the mirrored wall, the fountains that still play in the rain, the lion gate, all of it was built by a man who could not sleep in his own capital. 18 years later, Moggallana came back. The armies met on the plain below the rock. In the middle of the battle, Kashyap's war elephant turned aside to skirt a marsh. His own troops read the movement as a retreat and broke. Left alone at the front of a collapsing line, Kashyapa drew his dagger, cut his own throat, sheathed the blade, and fell. Sigiriya was abandoned as a capital almost immediately and given to Buddhist monks, who lived quietly in the caves at the base of the rock for the next 800 years. But Kalawewa is still there. The reservoir Datusena died for is holding water this morning. The Yoda Ella is running along the same line, at the same imperceptible slope, into the tanks of the same city. Restored, relined, and modernized in places, but following a route that a surveyor without instruments laid out around 1500 years ago. It irrigates tens of thousands of hectares of paddy. Farmers who have never read a chronicle open sluices, working on the principle Datusena's engineers arrived at in a landscape shaped entirely by their decisions. So when the question is, how 22 million people live on one small island, this is the answer. Not the beaches, and not the tea, and not the tourism figures. The answer is that a very long time ago, a succession of people decided that moving water mattered more than accumulating anything else. They built a machine out of earth, stone, and gradient. It ran for 1500 years, failed for 600, and was started again. And one of them told his son, standing on a dam wall with a blade waiting for him, that the water was all the treasure he owned. He was right in a way he could not have measured. There is one more thing that has to be said about water on this island, and it is the opposite of everything so far. On the 28th of November, 2025, Cyclone Ditwa made landfall on the east coast. It brought up to 500 millimeters of rain. All 25 districts were affected. Around 2.3 million people, roughly 1 in 10 of the population, were caught in it. The hill country, where the slopes were cleared for tea and the line rooms sit on unstable ground, came down in landslides. More than 600 people were killed. The World Bank put the direct physical damage at around $4.1 billion, close to 4% of everything the country produces in a year. 21 years earlier, on the morning of the 26th of December, 2004, the water came from the other direction. It is a Sunday. A crowded train called the Queen of the Sea is running down the coastal line near Perelia when the sea withdraws from the beach. People come out of the houses to look. Some climb onto the stopped train, believing it the safest place to stand. The second wave takes the carriages off the track and into the village behind them. Around 1,700 people die on that train. It is the deadliest rail disaster in recorded history. Across the island that morning, more than 35,000 people were killed. Both events did the same thing to the same country. Too much water, arriving too fast, in a place that spent 2,000 years learning to hold water because there was never enough. The island has the highest density of reservoirs on Earth, and it is not enough. A tank cascade was designed for a monsoon. It was not designed for 500 millimeters in a few days on deforested slopes. The line in the Chronicles said that no drop of rain should reach the ocean without serving people first. It is one of the most quoted sentences in the country's history, and for 8 centuries it read, as ambition. Read now, in a warming ocean, it reads more like a warning about how much water a landscape can be asked to hold. There is a small creature here that says all of this more quietly. Sri Lanka has more than 50 species of freshwater crab that exist nowhere else on Earth. Not 50 populations, 50 separate species, most described only in the last 30 years. Many of them are confined to a single stream or a single hill. A crab living in one valley belongs to a different species from the crab in the next valley over. They have been separated long enough by ridges and by rainfall to become distinct. That is what this island does to everything that lands on it. It divides, compresses, and specializes. Wet on one side of the mountains, dry on the other. A leopard at the highest density on Earth. A whale that never leaves. A crab that has never left one stream. And 22 million people on a piece of ground you can drive across in a day, sharing it with 6,000 elephants and living off water that was rooted into place by hand before most of the world's capitals existed. The system worked for 2,000 years. It failed once, completely, and took 6 centuries to come back. Whether it can absorb what the next century brings, more people, hotter seasons, heavier rain arriving in fewer days, is a question nobody on this island can answer yet. The tanks are still filling. The elephants are still walking to them. Nobody knows yet whether there is room. Thanks for watching, and until the next journey.